Right. Good morning, everyone. We will call the subcommittee hearing to order. I want to thank each of you for being here today, and especially want to thank our witnesses for being here today. We look forward to hearing from you. Last month, the Social Security Board of Trustees released its annual report on the fiscal status of Social Security programs, and it came as more unwelcome news for American seniors and workers. Like last year, both the trustees and the Congressional Budget Office project Social Security's retirement and survivors program will be unable to pay full benefits in less than a decade. What that means to the American people and those seniors that are near retirement or will be in retirement is that it could produce a benefit cut of somewhere between 21 and 25%. And the difference now is that now it's a year later and we are much closer to the insolvency. As we will hear today, the longer the wait, the harder the harder it's going to be to solve. It's clear that Social Security's cost growth is unsustainable. Program costs average 4.5% of GDP from 1994 to 2023 and are projected to grow rapidly to nearly 6% of GDP by 2034 as baby boomers continue to reach retirement age. Simply put, more people are and will be collecting Social Security for longer periods of time. And we are looking at a situation where we have fewer workers, a trend that is this trend is projected to continue for decades. To add insult to injury, President Biden's recent budget does nothing to address the pending exhaustion of the trust fund. And to make what matters worse, the cumulative effect is that it actually hurts Social Security's funding stream by billions of dollars over the next decade. On top of that, the Social Security Administration has done everything it can to push out rules and other policy changes that will result in tens of billions of dollars of new and unpaid for program costs that will only accelerate the trust fund exhaustion. Social Security is a vitally important part of every single American's life and retirement. So it's important that we don't downplay how bad the situation really is. To tell the American people that the most recent trustees report is good news because the projections push back insolvency by a few months is misleading and simply misses the point. These programs are in dire trouble, and sugarcoating the problem instead of seeking bipartisan solutions only puts seniors and workers at greater risk. The American people rightfully expect and deserve that we find a way to work together to save and strengthen this program. This starts here with an honest assessment of the program's finances and a sincere discussion of the size of the problem we need to solve. And I invite my colleagues here today to join in that discussion and have a very robust debate on what we need to do moving forward. I would now like to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Larson, for his opening statement. Mr. Larson, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your remarks. And I want to thank our panelists. It's not often that we get the Walter Cronkite of actuaries that's here, and so I'm pleased that we're going to hear straightforward talk. But let's cut to the chase. Congress has not done its job in over 50 years. We have not enhanced this program so that your constituents are better served. On average, every single one of our districts receives more than $200 million monthly to people that are on Social Security. It is arguably probably the best economic development plan that we have. And where do they spend that money? They spend it right back in the district. I can't help but get upset when you think about the fact that 10,000 baby boomers a day become eligible for Social Security. And they look and say, well, what's happened? Why hasn't Congress acted? We have a proposal that's out there. What Congress needs to do is something the public expects from us. Vote. You got a plan? We have a plan. We're happy to put our plan up for a vote. What's yours? What we hear is $1.5 trillion in cuts to Social Security? That's your idea of saving Social Security? Raising the age of Social Security recipients. The American public knows for every year you raise the age, that's a 7% cut in benefits. So the opening remarks of the chairman are that we're in dire straits. We'll see 20% plus cuts by 2033 if Congress does nothing. So your proposal is, well, let's do something. Let's make those cuts now by raising the age and cutting it 21% up front. It's long overdue to stop all of the dialogue, and how about vote? How about put out your plan, do what the people have asked us to do. Everybody agrees that there's a crisis, that there's a need here. So what do we get elected to do? I don't know how people go home and look themselves in the mirror and understand that there is 5 million of your fellow Americans that get below poverty level checks from Social Security. More than 70 million people, or close to 70 million people now, who rely on Social Security. 40% of them, it's the only benefit they have. And you, Congress, with the responsibility of changing that, do nothing. You don't vote. That's what we need more than anything else. Aside from laying out the numbers and getting the news, good and bad, then the question is, how do you solve the problem? Cutting Social Security doesn't solve the problem. It exacerbates it. You mean to tell me that things haven't changed in 53 years? Not having a COLA that works, having 5 million plus people who've paid into a system get below poverty level checks? What do you have against giving 23 million Americans a tax cut? These are the hardworking. You guys are going to work overtime to make sure that millionaires and billionaires get their tax cut. But the average working person, 23 million Americans that will get a tax cut if this Congress were to act, you don't care about. So whether it's a tax cut, whether it's getting benefits to the point where they're livable for people, and making sure that no one can retire into poverty, and repealing WEP and GPO and paying for it. Thank God for President Biden saying, hey, let's pay for this. Let's have people who pay nothing or next to nothing, millionaires and billionaires, just pay their fair share of what the guy making $50,000 or $30,000 a year has to pay all year long. You know what that does? It both allows us to extend the benefits and also allows us to extend the solvency. The choice is yours. If you've got a better idea, put it out there. But it seems like the only idea is to cut Social Security by $1.5 trillion and to cut people's benefits by raising the age 21% across the board. I yield back.
Thank you. I now have the pleasure of introducing our witnesses for the day. Stephen Goss is the Chief Actuary at the Social Security Administration. Dr. Philip Swagel is the Director of the Congressional Budget Office. And Barry Houston is an Analyst of Social Security Policy at the Congressional Research Service. Thank you all once again for being here. Look forward to have your remarks. You will have 5 minutes to deliver the oral remarks. Mr. Goss, you are now recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Ferguson, Ranking Member Larson, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you today about Social Security's program, past, present, and future. Social Security started paying monthly benefits, as you all well know, to qualifying retired workers and family members and survivors in 1940. Benefits to disabled workers and their families started in 1957. Over the 85 years through 2024, all scheduled benefits have been paid in full and on time. Social Security provides this fundamental insurance against loss of earned income due to old age, disability, and death for nearly all current and past workers and their families. Today, over 67 million people receive monthly benefits from the OSDI program, nearly 20% of the population, at a cost of 5.2% of GDP. By 2060, OSDI program cost is projected to rise to a stable roughly 6.1% of GDP, with over 23% of the population then expected to be receiving monthly benefits. But currently scheduled tax income remains at only 4.6% of GDP, so we have a shortfall to deal with. Over the 75 years as a whole, the unfunded obligation, the shortfall that we have over the period over the next 75 years, is 1.2% of GDP. We need to get these things back in balance. At the start of 2024, reserves in the combined OESI and DI trust funds total $2.8 trillion, nearly double the amount of annual payments. So our contingency reserve fund is strong at the moment. However, revenues to the combined OESI and DI trust funds are projected to be less than program cost in 2024, as they have been since 2010. In future years, under the intermediate projections for the 2024 trustees report. So combined OESI and DI reserves would become depleted in June of 2035. That is 13 months later than projected in last year's report, but it is still on the horizon. At that time, 83% of the scheduled benefits would still be payable. For the OESI trust fund alone, which is a separate legal entity, it is projected to become depleted in its reserves in November of 2033, 7 months later than in last year's report. Again, an incremental change, with 79% of scheduled benefits then payable from that fund alone. The DI trust fund is in good shape and not projected to have issues under the current projections through 2100 and beyond. Now, improvement in the 2024 trustees report is due to better than expected economic growth in 2023, a very good thing, and recognition of continued high labor productivity and employment levels through 2023 and expected to go on for the future. In addition, lower disability incidence and prevalence rates have continued. We do have on the horizon issues with the birth rate to be dealt with, obviously. Our projected annual shortfall for income to cover program cost should come as no surprise. The trustees have projected combined OESI trust fund reserve depletion will occur between 2033 and 2035 for the last 13 years' reports, and between 2029 and 2042 for the last 34 trustees' reports. The fundamental challenge of the changing age distribution of the adult population due to reduction in birth rates after 1965 was well known even in 1983, at the time of the last major amendments for this program. The 1983 amendments intended to accumulate substantial trust fund reserves, making full payment of scheduled benefits possible for decades to come. But these amendments were understood at that time not to be a permanent solution. Prior to the 1983 amendments, income was expected to cover only 93% of program cost for the year 1983, declining to 78% of scheduled cost for 2025. After the enactment of the 1983 amendments, tax income was projected to exceed program cost through 2020, but to cover only 93% of scheduled benefits for 2025, a year yet to come, declining to 86.5% by 2035, with trust fund reserves becoming depleted not until 2063 under those projections. However, annual tax income fell short of expectations after 1983 and fell below annual program cost starting in 2010 for two big reasons that had not been anticipated back in 1983. First, the share of covered earnings subject to the payroll tax declined from 90% in 1983, which is expected to persist, to just 82.5% over the next 17 years by the year 2000. Because average earnings grew much, much greater, by 62% more than inflation for the highest 6% of earners between 1983 and 2000, where the average wage grew by only 17% for the other 94% of workers across that period. Second, the deep recession of 2007 to 9, with only a very gradual 10-year recovery, reduced employment and earnings for a decade, causing us not to have the buildup of reserves that was expected. As a result, trust fund reserves did not accumulate to the level expected in '83, and our scheduled cost at this point is projected to cover our revenues to cover only about 86% of scheduled cost in 2025, declining to 84% by 2035. The combined OESDI reserves are now projected to become depleted in 2035, almost 30 years earlier than in 1983 for the two reasons already mentioned.
Mr. Goss, we've allowed you a little latitude to go over by about a minute, and if we could, I'm going to get you to yield, try to keep everybody on the 5-minute clock, and I'm sure we'll get into more of this really important information through member questions. With that, Dr. Swagel, I'm going to call on you for your 5 minutes.
Very good. Thank you, Chairman Ferguson, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify about Social Security. Social Security faces a significant financial challenge. Under current law, in our projections, the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund is exhausted in fiscal year 2033, and the Disability Insurance Trust Fund is exhausted in 2061. If the two trust funds were combined, they would be exhausted in fiscal year 2034. After the trust funds are exhausted, we project that the resources to pay benefits in 2035 would be 21% less than the amount of scheduled benefits. And that shortfall would increase over time. In CBO's projections, about 82 million people, that's roughly 1/5 of the US population, receive Social Security benefits in 2035. That's a projection. If all Social Security benefits were reduced by the same percentage in that year, lower income households would reduce their spending by more and increase the amount they work by more in percentage terms than households with higher lifetime incomes. Legislative action would be needed to avoid this scenario. The imbalance between the system's revenues and scheduled benefit payments extends beyond 2034, and that imbalance grows over time. We project that the actuarial deficit over the next 75 years equals 1.5% of GDP, or 4.4% of taxable payroll. So that is, scheduled benefits could be paid over 75 years through 2098 if payroll tax rates were increased by 4.4 percentage points right away, from 12.4% to 16.8%, and that's an increase of 35%. That's a 35% tax hike. Alternatively, a reduction in scheduled benefits of 24% would permit full payment of those smaller benefits through 2098. And of course, a combination of changes to taxes and benefits or relying on resources from the Treasury's General Fund could also suffice. And policymakers, you and your colleagues, can have different changes apply to people of different incomes and people of different ages. Additional changes would be needed to ensure solvency beyond 2098. The aging of the population is a key factor affecting the finances of Social Security. The number of people aged 65 or older who are less likely to work and pay payroll taxes and who are generally eligible for Social Security benefits is projected to grow faster than the number of people aged 25 to 54 who are more likely to work and to pay payroll taxes. Population growth is determined by births, deaths, and net immigration. Fertility in our projection remains lower than replacement. We project life expectancy will continue to increase. And immigration is now an increasingly important part of the growth of the US population and the US labor force. And all of these demographic changes affect the financial status of Social Security. A feature of CBO's work is that the demographic and economic projections used in our Social Security analysis are consistent with those used in CBO's baseline projections and for other purposes. In closing, let me note that any projection over a horizon of 7 decades is inherently uncertain, but it is clear that action is needed to make Social Security financially sustainable. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Swagel. Mr. Houston, it's now time for your 5 minutes.
Chairman Ferguson, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Barry Houston, and I am an analyst with the Congressional Research Service. Today's Social Security is different from one that was enacted in 1935. The program matured from one that covered about half of workers and paid benefits only to retired workers to one that covers almost all workers and pays benefits to retired and disabled workers and their eligible family members. This year, Social Security will pay benefits to over 67 million beneficiaries, and about 182 million workers will work in covered employment. Most of these workers will become future beneficiaries. The program's ability to pay benefits to current and future beneficiaries is determined by its revenues, costs, and its trust funds. Current and projected imbalances between these elements indicate the program will not be able to pay the full amounts of scheduled benefits in about 11 years. The largest source of revenue is payroll taxes, about 91% of revenues in 2023. The tax, evenly split between employees and employers, is levied on covered earnings up to an annual limit. This annual limit generally rises with wage growth in the economy. As average wages are projected to increase, along with the number of covered workers, so too are projected revenues from payroll taxes. The second source of revenue is income from the taxation of Social Security benefits, about 4% of revenues in 2023. About half of beneficiaries pay federal income tax on a portion of their benefits. The thresholds used to determine tax liability are fixed in law and not indexed. For this reason, among others, projected revenue from the taxation of benefits is expected to increase. In previous years, tax revenues exceeded the amounts needed to pay benefits. Under law, the trust funds hold excess revenues in interest-bearing government securities. And in 2023, interest income on these asset reserves accounted for about 5% of revenues. However, with costs now exceeding revenues and increasing amounts of asset reserves projected to be redeemed to help pay benefits, this revenue source is projected to decrease and will approach zero as the asset reserves are depleted. In 2023, monthly benefits accounted for 99% of costs. Costs are expected to increase for several reasons, such as increasing average initial benefits, an increasing number of beneficiaries, and increasing beneficiary longevity. Although the benefit computation process is the same for all workers, average initial benefits generally increase for successive birth cohorts since the process indexes for wage growth, which is typically positive. The process results in stable replacement rates across birth cohorts, that is, initial benefit levels as a percentage of career pre-retirement earnings are consistent across cohorts. It also results in progressivity. Workers with relatively lower career average earnings experience a relatively higher replacement rate. In the years to come, an increasing number of covered workers will become beneficiaries. As remaining life expectancy at older ages continues to increase, they are expected to remain in current payment status for longer periods of time, on average. For these reasons, in addition to other factors such as cost of living adjustments, costs are projected to increase. The program's revenue and costs are expected to increase in aggregate nominal dollars. Comparing the projected income and cost rates revealed that for several decades, costs are projected to increase relative to revenues. This imbalance impacts the program's ability to pay full scheduled benefits. Since 2021, the program has relied on asset reserves to help pay scheduled benefits and can continue to do so for about 11 more years. Once asset reserves are depleted, continuing revenues are projected to cover about 3/4 of scheduled benefits. Lawmakers may choose from a wide range of revenue-increasing or cost-reducing provisions to help eliminate this imbalance. The Social Security amendments of 1983, generally considered the program's last major reform, use both types of provisions, among others. Depending on what provisions may be included in future legislation, changes may affect groups of workers and beneficiaries in different ways. Changes implemented sooner rather than later, in addition to requiring cost-reducing or revenue-increasing provisions that are smaller in magnitude, would allow workers and beneficiaries more time to adjust their behavior. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you all for your testimony, and we'll now start with questions, and I will start with that. Dr. Swagel, I want to start with you and talk to you about, you made a comment that just kind of caught me off. You suggested that one way of fixing this problem are general fund transfers to address the shortfall. If we did that, if we used that methodology, talk to us just very briefly about what that would do to the federal debt and deficit each year, and what that potentially could do to interest rates and the amount of interest that the taxpayers are already paying.
Yes, sir. As I said, the shortfall could be, addressed in many ways. Transferring funds from general revenues, the amount of dollars that would be needed in our projections is nearly $400 billion in 2033 and about $550 billion in 2034. And in real dollars, the Treasury would have to come up with those additional dollars. That would mean either reductions in other spending or additional borrowing. That would mean more crowding out and impact on interest rates and so on.
And given our level of debt right now, that does not seem like a viable option. That's not a question. That's a statement from me. I also want to ask you about, in the shortfall category, we hear a lot about, the income cap right now. If people are making more than $168,000 a year, they're not paying their fair share. Currently, if you're paying above that, you're not, even if you're paying $168,000 a year, paying Social Security taxes on $168,000 a year, there's still a shortfall. I mean, there's a difference between what you're paying in and what you're actually getting back. And then and we've always tied the level of benefit to earnings, correct? So if you raise the cap, then in theory, you would also raise the amount of earnings that people were eligible for down the road, or you would have to simply say, the answer is you're going to pay more in taxes, but you're going to receive less benefit. Is that a fair assessment?
That's right. In some sense, the system as a whole is progressive. So thinking of lifetime benefits against lifetime contributions, the bottom quintile of people, with the bottom quintile, the lowest 20% of lifetime earners, gets about 2.5 times back in benefits as what they pay in contributions. People in the middle get about 1.5 times. The top 20% on average gets about 1, so it's 1 to 1. So that's the sense in which the system as a whole is progressive.
And it's my understanding that if we subjected all earnings in the U.S. to the Social Security payroll tax, we'd still have about a $10 trillion shortfall over the next 75 years.
So I don't have that number in my head. I can tell you, if we increase the taxable share back to 90%, it's around 82.5 now, so made 90% taxable, that would delay exhaustion by 4 years. If we said everything above $250,000 is taxable, that would delay exhaustion by 13 years. So it makes a difference, but there's still a challenge after that.
Okay. Mr. Goss, question for you. When you look at what Social Security has done in terms of enhancing benefits and paying out more, would you say that couples that retire now, on average, receive a much greater benefit than, say, couples that retired back in the 90s? Adjusted for dollars.
Well, if we look at benefits, as Barry indicated, the nature of the benefit formula is that it tends to rise with the average wage over time. So that people from one generation to the next, if they've had higher wage levels, a higher standard of living, that Social Security benefits has been intended to maintain, therefore a higher benefit level to give them a similar replacement rate. In that regard, individuals and couples now who are retiring and getting benefits are not really receiving more than generations in the past. In fact, one of the major changes, obviously, in the 1983 amendments was to change the normal retirement age, which increased it by from 65 up to 67.
So,
and that actually lowered the average monthly benefit for people, all else equal.
So it's you would argue with the fact that a couple who turned 65 in 1990 on average receive $590,000 in lifetime benefits. and that's adjusted for 2023 dollars. When compared to a couple that turned 65 in 2020, they were projected to receive $812,000. And I look at it, and it looks like that the formula has actually increased, has pushed up the amount of lifetime earnings that a couple could see. Now, I say this to say that, you know, we have seen an increase in benefits over the years. It's not to argue that it's perfect, but we have seen that increase. Mr. Houston, I want to touch on one other thing, if I could, talking about, you know, the other things that our seniors, and look, seniors depend on this program, and we have an obligation, and it's important that we honor that Congress honors what it said it would do for the recipients of these benefits. But I look at this and I think to myself, in 50 years, there have been a lot of other programs that are out there to help seniors as well. I'm going to tick through just a small list of these things. SNAP program, Older Americans Act, Housing Choice Vouchers, Weatherization Assistance Program, the LEHIP or Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program, Lifeline programs, reverse mortgages, the Seniors Farmers Market Nutrition Program. My point is you can go on and on. And I think Congress as a whole over the years, while it has made adjustments, while the formula for Social Security has said we're going to see an increase in payments, but we've also done an awful lot to make sure that seniors have resources in many other areas for housing and food assistance and quite candidly, Medicare with health care as well, and there have been some great things that we've done there. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that seniors don't have any other lifelines and this is the only thing. It's simply, we've got a lot, that seniors have a lot that they can depend on, and I think Congress has been very thoughtful in making sure that they've got the resources that they need. Again, I want to thank you for y'all's testimony, and now I am going to yield 5 minutes to my friend, Mr. Larson, for his questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. And yeah, I almost don't know where to start, but basically, when I listen to the chairman speak, it's that, hey, you folks out there who are depending on Social Security, look, you already get enough. And for God's sake, what we don't want to do at all costs is make sure that billionaires pay their fair share, because that would be, you know, and then hypothetically, what would happen? Dr. Swagel, has the general fund ever been used to pay for Social Security?
You know, I don't.
And so it's never been used, but hypothetically, that's what we're using here to try to say to the American public that somehow this is part of it contributes to the debt and deficit. That is total BS. Now, let me ask a couple of questions here. Mr. Goss, if we were to raise the retirement age by 3 years, as has been proposed, what would that mean in terms of cut to benefits if we went from 67 to 70?
It would depend on how rapidly we did this, but at the point at which we had the retirement age raised by the 3 years, as you'd indicated earlier, that reduces retirement benefits, monthly benefits, and lifetime benefits by about 6.5% to 7% for each year that we raise. So an additional 3-year increase in the normal retirement age would in fact lower benefits by on the order of 20%.
Now, Mr. Goss, also, because we heard this question as well, what percentage of income does someone who makes $1 billion in wages contribute to Social Security?
Well, given that the most they're going to pay is their 6.2%, they and their employer on the first $168,600, I think the number comes out for a billionaire, for somebody with $1 billion of earnings, to about 0.1% of their total wages paid by them, and another 0.1% paid by their employer.
And what is a person making? What percentage is a person making $50,000 pay?
Well, they would pay their 6.2% by themselves and their employer matching
So
that.
again,
with another
because we want to
6.2.
protect these billionaires and millionaires, it's unconscionable to think about the fact that they ought to pay their fair share, that they ought to be in a position where, as President Biden points out, if they do, we extend the solvency of the program for 66 years and we're able to add on benefits. I have another question that comes up because this happens frequently on the trail. Can you talk about how Social Security actually doesn't contribute a penny to the national debt?
Yes, be happy to. As I think everybody here is very well aware, Social Security has its trust funds, and the trust funds can only have positive balances. Social Security now has and never has had the ability to borrow from the general fund of the Treasury. That is in the current law. Anything could change in the future, but currently Social Security can only hold asset reserves, and as a result, with a roughly $34 trillion of total federal debt we have now, Social Security is actually covering approximately $3 trillion of that and not needing to be borrowed from the public at the moment. So Social Security can only really help service some of the debt that the rest of the government develops. It does not contribute towards the debt.
So for the general public to understand this, it's called a trust fund for a reason. And that trust fund has not been tapped into, nor will it ever be tapped into unless members of Congress have a different idea and want to change it. And they could through a vote if they decided that this is the tack they want to take. But the fact of the matter is, and it is a fact, that it doesn't contribute to the debt or deficit. And what aggravates people the most is they pay into this. So does their employer, but their employer gets a tax write-off. 23 million Americans get double taxed under current Social Security programs, and we as a body are the only ones that can change that. And instead, we don't put forward proposals that direct making the system both solvent and enhancing benefits because people desperately need this money. 40% of our fellow Americans is the only thing they have. 28 million Americans.
Gentleman's time has expired. We'll now move to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Carey.
I want to thank the chairman. I also want to thank the ranking member, as well as the witnesses, for being here today. Since day one, I have been a strong advocate for the strength and integrity of Social Security Trust Fund. Unfortunately, if my numbers are correct, under this budget, if enacted, the administration's budget would cut approximately $17 billion to the Social Security Trust Fund over the next decade. Now, I'm the grandson of a couple that lived only on Social Security, and I watched how they script and saved and tried to do what they could. So, with that being said, I'm dedicated to working with my colleagues both on the Democrat side and Republican side to find some solutions. So, Mr. Gross and Director Swagel, the trustees and the Congressional Budget Office projected that under current law, Social Security's Age-Old and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund would be depleted by 2033. We've established that. At which point, the program will only be able to pay a fraction of the promised benefits. Absent any changes, what percentage of retirement and survivor benefits would be payable after the trust fund is depleted?
So our projections in the latest trustees report indicate that in 2033, the OESI trust fund alone should we reach the point where we do deplete the reserves and have only continuing income coming in, that would cover about 79% at that point of the scheduled benefits that people are expecting.
Director?
Right, and we're just a little bit less than that, so we see the shortfall is a little bit less, but in the same ballpark.
So so how is that projected to change in the years after 2033? Mr.
After 2033, that percentage will, of course, decline. I know off the top of my head for the total Social Security OESI and DI, they'll drop from 83% eventually down to 73% by the time we get to about 2098. And will be a little bit less than 73% payable for the OESI Trust Fund alone by that time.
Director?
Right, and again, we have the same general result. We see the shortfall is a bit larger, and so the decline in benefits a bit larger, but is broadly similar to what the trustees have.
Thank you both. Mr. Houston, the 1983 amendments were the last time that Social Security saw major program reforms and intended to address the system's funding shortfalls. Can you help us understand how those reforms came to be and what Social Security's finances looked like leading up to those reforms?
Thank you. The 1977 amendments were the previous major reform, and they were estimated to get the program to be solvent for about 50 more years. The economic experience right after that proved to be much worse. In the 1980 trustees report, they highlighted that benefits would be not paid the full scheduled amount in under 2 years. Later in 1980, Congress passed a temporary reallocation of the payroll tax from the disability program to the old age and survivors insurance program. Later in 1981, as the situation continued to deteriorate, Congress authorized interfund borrowing, and President Reagan established what became known as the Greenspan Commission. The Commission's report included provisions that would have resolved about 2/3 of the projected shortfall and became the basis for the 83 amendments. Congress later added several more provisions which covered about the remaining 1/3 of the shortfall. And when it passed in April of 83, it was estimated that the OASI program was months, if not weeks, away from being able to pay the full amount of scheduled benefits.
Thank you for that. I'm going to follow up to Mr. Goss. How does the projected cash imbalance in 2033 compare to the imbalance in the early 1980s?
The projected imbalance in 2033, let's see, I think I actually had the numbers in the testimony here for 2035. We are at this point actually having a fairly significant imbalance in 2035, much more than was expected after the 1983 amendments. Again, really primarily for the one factor of the changing distribution of earnings in the economy. We've actually lost, as mentioned, I think Dr. Swigel mentioned earlier, we've gone from 90% down to 82% of all covered earnings being below our taxable maximum. That's an 8% reduction in the amount of revenue that we would have expected. And that cumulatively, ever since 1983, has had a major effect on the level of trust fund reserves that we have. And that's the primary reason why we have...
My time has expired. I thank the witnesses, and I thank the chair for his giving me the opportunity. Thanks so much.
Thank the gentleman from Ohio. Next, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say that it feels like we've been here before. It feels a little bit like Groundhog Day in this committee, because each time that this subcommittee convenes to talk about the future of Social Security in this country, we hear plenty of proposed solutions on the Democratic side. For example, my friend, Ranking Member Larson, has pushed Social Security reforms again and again. He's very passionate about this issue. And his plan, Social Security 2100, would increase benefits across the board, repeal WEP and GPO, and make Social Security work better for every American. And all of those benefits that we've just talked about would be paid for, and they would serve those who need them the most. My Republican colleagues, on the other hand, are proposing significant cuts to Social Security. And while those cuts would be detrimental to all Americans, it would disproportionately impact people of color who would be affected the most by cuts. People of color are less likely to work for employers who offer pensions or any kind of retirement plans, so they're more likely to rely on Social Security after retirement. Proposed cuts to Social Security would really be a direct attack on those communities of color, specifically the Latino population, who relies almost exclusively on Social Security for their retirement. Once again, we are hearing talk about Republican plans to cut benefits, and in stark contrast, the Democratic plans, which are to increase benefits for those in need. I very much appreciate our witnesses coming here today to discuss this issue. Mr. Hudson helpfully outlined what this subcommittee already knows, that the combined trust fund will hypothetically be depleted sometime after the year 2035. Everyone on this dais knows that this is a problem, but the real disagreement comes in how do we fix it? I hear my colleagues across the aisle maintain that, slashing Social Security benefits or privatizing Social Security and raising the retirement age is somehow going to benefit Social Security as a whole, and I disagree with that. As my dear friend, Ranking Member Larson always says, Social Security is the most successful anti-poverty program in our country. So we shouldn't be talking about slashing benefits, increasing the retirement age, privatizing Social Security. We need to find a very thoughtful path forward, and I think my friend Mr. Larson's proposal is that path forward. I just want to quickly talk about something that was mentioned in terms of who pays into the Social Security Trust Fund and the fact that the fertility rate in the United States is declining. Our birth rate is not replacement rate, but there is one potential avenue for finding the workers that we're going to need in the future if our economy is going to continue to grow and if we're going to keep the Social Security Fund solvent, and that is immigration and immigration reform. That is something that I've been working on for 22 years in this Congress, and we have done nothing other than throw more money at the border, more enforcement. If we provided pathways to citizenship for people like dreamers who were brought to this country when they were children, have never known another country but this, they want to work, they want to pay taxes, they want to pay into the system. If we were to increase legal pathways to citizenship, I think our Social Security Trust Fund would be in better shape. Is there anybody on the panel that disagrees with that? Okay, that's what I suspected. And yet we cannot get traction for a comprehensive overhaul of our broken immigration system so that we will have the workers of the future that we're going to need if we want our country's economy to continue to grow. I have nothing further other than to say, it's a little disheartening when we have a system right now where a professional baseball player who earns millions of dollars in a season hits the Social Security cap in their first at-bat of the season, and for the rest of the season does not pay into the Social Security Trust Fund. I think if we could balance that out to make a little bit fairer for everybody, we would find some revenue to extend the livelihood of the Social Security Trust Fund. I don't understand why that proposal is not one that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are willing to consider. And with that, I will yield back.
As a Braves fan, we would support that coming all out of the Nationals payroll. With that, we will, and I thank the lady for her comments. With that, we will yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweiker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Swagel, first off, don't all workers, whether they're just on a work visa, a dreamer, even if they don't have U.S. citizenship, they're paying a FICA tax, correct?
The ones who are in the country
Legally,
lawfully.
yeah,
That's
working
right.
legally. Okay,
Yeah.
just want to, because that was a misnomer. I want to work through, because there's some baseline problems I have between CBO numbers and the actuary report. I think the actuary report already understands their fertility calculations are substantially off from even census's math and those. So, but let's walk through some stuff here. For just this year, so let's do our 2024 year. We have payroll taxes, income tax for beneficiaries, and the interest, because they're going to make about 6% of the fund is going to come in as interest. I have $1,166 billion. Okay. I have the spend in the 2024 fiscal year of $1,480,000,000. Do those sort of match up with your numbers? That means the 2024 reaching into the trust fund will be $314 billion this year.
Yeah, that's close to what I've got.
Okay, so it's 26 billion a month is reached into the trust fund and used to supplement the checks that are going out the door.
That's right, and the money from the trust fund is, the securities of the trust fund redeemed by the Treasury.
Yeah, it's the special T-bills, but some people don't understand that there were, 6% of the entire revenues, at least this fiscal year, on Social Security are actually interest that the general fund pays for having borrowed the money. That's right. So you do have the weird multiplier, and then there's the tax on benefits, which is about 4%. I wanted to make sure, because there was a couple of things said that made it sound like the trust fund isn't already in play. It's in play this year. Over $314 billion will be borrowed from the trust fund this year. Refunded. The trust fund will cash in.
Redeeming the securities. That's right.
A couple other things I want to walk through, and instead of me leading you on these, I have 3 or 4 charts here. What do you see as the biggest differentials between SSA baseline and the CBO baseline? Particularly, I'm looking at, you have a fairly substantial difference in out years on, their baseline. You also have some different calculations on the caps. But first, off the top of your head, can you give me what you see as differences on how the CBO actuaries built their model compared to the SSA?
Sure. I can talk to that, and I know Steve will have a lot to say also. So we do have different modeling technologies. So I'll just set that aside. We do things slightly differently. We do current law, and they assume some changes in the law, outside of Social Security, but in the tax law. In the parameters, the sort of numbers, where we have different GDP growth, and Steve highlighted that this year, they bumped up GDP growth, and that just slightly more than offset, they're moving toward, sort of what's happening on fertility. So it's growth, fertility, they have much higher interest rates further out, and then immigration. We've picked up the immigration surge. It's not yet in the population numbers, but working with DHS numbers, we've picked that up.
And where I was really going with this was not to pick on the Social Security actuaries or the CBO. Yeah. It was more, I'm trying to head towards the fragility of the numbers. Mm-hmm. When we did our math last year, the exhaustion, the first year of exhaustion was 616 billion short. Now it's 400 and some.
Yeah, and in ours, that's immigration. And then, since it's from last year to this year, we picked up immigration. And in some sense, we picked up that the immigration surge started in 2021.
Okay, so year of exhaustion, you pick up a couple $100 billion just on what you consider immigration population.
The immigration surge, that's right.
Okay, but it also actually should give us a sense of the level of fragility if we were to go into recession. Let's say it's a mild recession. Would we probably see, because you just had a $200 billion change at the end of the 10 in a single cycle. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to get some sense of the fragility of that baseline.
No. I agree that a recession would affect wages, would affect contributions. It would also affect fertility. Right after the 2008 recession, financial crisis, and after the pandemic, fertility declined. It came up a bit, but not, it didn't go back to
but then it took a big spike downward last year. We went to 1.63. So, and I'm over my time. Mr. Chairman, without objection, I have a number of charts that we've worked on with both taking from the Actuary report and then some notes from the Joint Economic Economists. I'd like to add those to the record.
Without objection, your charts are added to the record.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Next, we'll call on the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Kildee. You're now recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing, and to our witnesses, thank you so very much for being here, and perhaps more importantly, for your years of work on this and other subjects. I'm from Michigan, and in Michigan, over 2 million seniors rely on Social Security just to make ends meet. For most of those folks, Social Security is the most important source of income retirement income, and in fact, for many, it's the only source of retirement income that they depend on. They have contributed, these folks that I represent, and we all represent, have contributed to Social Security with every paycheck and rightfully expect that it will be waiting for them when it's time for them to retire. That's sort of the deal. When you work hard, you play by the rules, you ought to be able to retire with dignity. Those American workers have lived up, paycheck to paycheck, have lived up to their end of the deal, and so it's really important that Congress, on behalf of the American people, live up to our end of the deal and make sure that that benefit that they paid for, that was promised to them, is waiting for them. Democrats on this committee, it's been mentioned, Mr. Larson's leadership on this issue, Democrats on this committee are focused on delivering on that promise, and we're willing, even if it's hard, even if it may not be perfect, we're willing to put our name behind a proposal to fix this problem. And that's why we put up our solution to shore up the Social Security trust funds, to increase benefits, important part of this provision, for current and future retirees. We do so by making the wealthiest Americans pay into Social Security at the same rate as those Bay City teachers that I represent, or Saginaw firefighters that I represent, Midland factory workers that I represent are paying out of their paychecks. This approach stands, as has been said, in pretty stark contrast to the proposals, or lack of proposals, put forward by our Republican colleagues. Now, we haven't seen a legislative approach prepared and drafted and dropped in the hopper. We have done ours, but we do know that the Republican Study Committee, which 80% of House Republicans belong to, recently released their budget plan for 2025. And under their plan, Republicans would cut Social Security benefits by $1.5 trillion. You can say it's this or that or the other thing, but you take that kind of money out of the program. Someone's going to have to lose a benefit. This proposal, which raises the retirement age and cuts benefits for family members, couldn't be more out of step from what I hear back home about the solutions that people want to see us take up. For the Michiganders, the seniors that I represent, barely getting by on their Social Security check, the answer to the long-term solvency of Social Security is not to increase the retirement age, not to cut benefits. It's time that we advance legislation that increases Social Security benefits to reflect the true cost of living that they experience, and does so by making the wealthiest Americans, who have done extraordinarily well, as evidenced by some of the data dating back to the 1983 reform. The millionaires and billionaires have done extraordinarily well, and they certainly can step up and do their fair share. Again, it's time to move legislation that does not cut benefits, that solves this problem by making sure that the people at the very top of our economy pay their fair share. That's what our legislation would do. And I want to ask a question. I just want to say to Mr. Houston, Mr. Goss, Mr. Swagel, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for keeping us informed with the facts. The facts speak to the need for us to take action. I look forward to working for my remaining time here in Congress alongside each and every one of you to make sure we solve this problem. So thanks for your service to our country. I would yield to Ms. Sanchez.
Yeah, I just want to put a finer point on the immigration issue. When we have an underground economy, when workers are not part of the legal system, they do not pay into the Social Security system. Is that correct? Does anybody disagree with that?
That's correct.
So if we had opened up legal pathways for folks to naturalize and get their citizenship, they then would be, if they were working, paying into the Social Security system. Is that not correct?
That would make a significant difference. There are cases where people are not legally authorized, but they may nonetheless have earnings reported on their behalf by their employer with tax revenue coming into the trust funds. It goes into what we call the earnings suspense file. They will likely not ever get any benefit credit, but payroll taxes still accrue in many cases where people are not legally work authorized.
But that probably isn't the norm, because I would expect that a cash underground economy, nobody's contributing into the Social Security Trust Fund.
If people are paid cash, literally, absolutely.
So again, if we opened up legal pathways for those folks to regularize their status, we could boost what goes into the Social Security Trust Fund, correct? Thank you, and I thank the gentleman from yielding.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Kustoff for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for appearing today. If I could, Mr. Goss, if if I could ask a question more on process than substance for a moment. I'm a big believer that we can always look to history to, when we are trying to address issues and problems and see what was done right and see what was done wrong. From a historical perspective, giving guidance to us, can you talk about the 1983 process and lessons that we can learn right and wrong to help direct us?
Wonderful question. Thanks very much. And I was actually there working with Moynihan and Dolan and others throughout the Greenspan Commission and after. It was a wonderful process. I would say that what we really need to do is to do that more and more often, to have the kind of discussion we're having today, to talk about the possibilities through the Greenspan Commission and through the conference committee that actually developed the 83 amendments. We made a lot of progress. One of the shortfalls that we had at the time was computers have advanced a little bit since 1983. We were not able to overnight develop a full annual projection of what the implications of reform would be at that time. We're now able to do that literally overnight. For example, the fact that we had the big rise up in trust fund reserves expected in the 83 amendments and then dropping down at the end, had we had more time, we might have been able to smooth that out and been in better shape. But we're now in much better shape to do that. If I might just add, by the way, I think Phil and I can have to talk because our projected shortfall for the calendar year 2024 for the OESDI program as a whole, our reduction in our trust fund reserves is $100 billion. I think I heard $300 billion. What's curious here is that, in fact, from the 2023 trustees report last year to the new one, the economy did so much better in 2023 that actually we're in better shape now. And here's the really good news. The end of 2023 and so far in 2024, the economy is actually operating better now than we even had included in our 2024 trustees report. I assume that's probably the same for the CBO projections. So I'm not quite sure why CBO is seeing a $300 billion drop in trust fund reserves, where the trustees, on what are conservative assumptions so far for 2024, are seeing only a $100 billion drop.
Are there other lessons, good or bad, that we can learn from the 1983 process?
I think the lesson that we learned then was that there was great cross-aisle discussion, bicameral, bipartisan. It was a wonderful experience dealing with people all looking towards where we were. Now, of course, the one shortfall was that it was so late in the game,
Right.
as Barry mentioned earlier. So the fact that we're now roughly 10 years before the point of reaching reserve depletion is wonderful. If we could have that kind of cross the aisle discussion and come to serious discussion about what we want to do for the American people, that would be wonderful. So there was great bipartisan discussion back in the day, but it was very late in the game. We're now in a nice position of being 10 years before reserve depletion to be able to hopefully come up with a good approach.
Thank you, Mr. Goss. Mr. Houston, can I talk to you about your report for CRS? You have a section in there about interest income. And you show the disparity in interest income to about 2008, 2009, 2010, and then it drops off. Can you walk us through the early 2000s to about 2009, 2010, and walk us through the present as it relates to interest income and its relevance?
Sure. So as I had mentioned in my oral and my written testimony, there's three sources of revenues to the trust funds. One is the payroll taxes, another is taxation on benefits, and in years where there's excess tax revenues, those excess funds get invested in interest-bearing government securities. And then the trust fund earns interest on those, and that becomes the third source of revenue. Interest income that is not needed to pay benefits gets credited back to the trust funds, and the trust funds never needed to rely on that interest income till about 2009, 2010. Starting in 2009, the cost rates started to exceed the income rates, and the income stream started to be used as a means to help pay benefits. That's been moving forward up until 2021, when in addition to the interest income, the program has also needed to rely in part on the trust fund assets themselves to help pay benefits.
Good. Thank you very much. My time has expired. I yield back.
I would ask for just little bit of leeway here from my colleagues before I call on Ms. Moore. Dr. Swagel, I believe that I saw you wanted to respond to the question about the difference between Social Security's estimates and CBO's estimate on the withdrawal of the 100 billion versus 300 billion.
Yeah, I mean, and since it's
And if you could make this quick.
Yeah, sure. Of course, there's lots of numbers. So it's $150 billion now that the trust fund expenditures exceed the income, and that's rising to $500 billion in our projections by 2034.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And now the gentlelady from Wisconsin, Ms. Moore, you're now recognized.
Thank you so much, and I am always delighted to talk about our premier program that prevents seniors from living in poverty, and particularly important for our disabled community, women, people of color. I want to start out by thanking one of our witnesses, Mr. Goss, for diligently working with me and my staff and answering questions that we have given you in writing. I think it's important when we talk about Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, then when we talk about Social Security, we talk about it in real terms, that we really come to the table, coming together in good faith. And my concern is that it's not good faith to come to the table scaring young people, telling them not to rely on Social Security because it won't be there anymore. So many young people have bought into the idea that it's hopeless to ever rely on it, or to, that's not a realistic way of fixing it. It's not fair to come to the table and say to people the only way that we can fix it is to cut benefits by 25%. You can't say that you're working toward a solution to say that we ought to raise the retirement age. You look at all the gray hair up here. It's one thing for us to be doing this kind of work at our age. When I think about the people that I need to fix the gutters on my house, I don't think any of them are going to make it by increasing the age. But one of the things that I just wanted to review with you, Mr. Goss, there are lots of, so there are many roads to the city. Before I talk to you, I want to talk to Mr. Swagel. You shared with my colleague, Ms. Sanchez, that you thought immigration reform was a real vital way to improve the receipts, the payroll receipts. And you also mentioned, as Mr. Schweikert well knows, that we have decreased population, and we're facing a fertility crisis. And so, we have several approaches to immigration, but I once read the CBO report that within a window of a 10-year budget window, we could see a $1 trillion increase minimum if we were to have some sort of immigration reform. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, what we've said is that the immigration surge we project from 21 to 2026 will result in about $1 trillion of additional revenue. We're working further on that, so we'll have an update of that soon, but it's still
that's only 5 years, $1 trillion.
Over the 10-year period.
Over the 10-year
5 years of
period.
immigrants over 10
So I
years.
just wanted to remind us of that. Mr. Goss, you sent me a really long memo. Be careful of what you ask for. People actually might write you back. So what I asked you to analyze was how could we maintain the solvency of this program, but yet be humane and recognize that people were getting older, that people were losing benefits because 5 years of their lives have gone toward child care, rearing women who never don't get that credited. People over 80, kids who lost their benefit. There have been so many teary-eyed members of Congress that have talked about how they were able to go to college after their dad died. And so I propose restoring all those benefits and still extending the life of Social Security by 24 years. I have 42 seconds. Take it away, sir, and sort of review this thick memo for us.
Well, thank you very much. There's no question that we can maintain the benefits we have now, but we do need more revenue in the future because of what's happened with the changing earnings distribution and the changing number of working age people versus retirement age people in our country, largely because of the birth rate dropping. We do have a situation where to maintain the level of benefits we have scheduled in current law, we will need more
So,
revenue.
I mean, it's a modest change in benefits. Like right now, we have a combined contribution level of 12.4%. If we were to increase it by 13%, payroll and employee, that is how we achieve that 24-year increase. So, you pay a penny today for benefits for 25 more years. Am I correct?
That's right. And let me just also go back to immigration that you mentioned, which is so important. We have less than 4 million births per year in this country, but our net immigration is on the order of 1 million. That's an enormous help in terms of maintaining our population in the future. We've had such a drop in births because of the birth rate since 1965 that having elevated immigration would be a big help in maintaining our population and the age distribution, which would have enormous ramifications.
Gentlemen,
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, let me thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Ranking Member, and I will yield back.
thank you, Ms. Moore. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I refer to something Mr. Larson said. I'm not even sure where to start here. There's a lot to talk about. This has been a great conversation. A few things I want to mention, I think. Mr. Goss, you had responded in an answer to a question from Mr. Kustoff about the commission or the deal in '83 and talked very positively about that, really people coming together and resolving this, putting everything on the table and making it solvent for years to come. We could do that again, right? And we should do that.
Absolutely. We're much looking forward to that.
Yeah, and I'd like to suggest to Mr. Larson and others who I think are sincere about the desire to fix Social Security, there's a difference between proposing a bill that doesn't go anywhere and having a real bipartisan discussion about resolving this. And so I guess I'd like to suggest the Fiscal Commission that we had recommended that looks at both debt and Social Security really is an attempt to do that. And I know you've spoken out.
Would the gentleman yield?
Let me finish my sentence, and I'll be happy to. I know you've spoken out against that, and I'm telling you in all sincerity that I think that we could resolve this if we had that kind of conversation with the American people. We could do what has been done in '83, and we could take your bill and others and put them together and really resolve this for the American people. I can tell you that I'm certainly interested in doing that. People on our side are interested in doing that, and we're willing to put everything on the table. And so, yes, I'll yield.
So what is it you're putting on the table, number one? And there are many Social Security proposals that exist out there, not just Social Security 2100. But also, there's a big difference between the Greenspan Commission and the commission that was proposed behind closed doors with only a select group of people with a decision that would require only an up or down vote. That is, that's not a democratic, let's sort through this, let's have this exposed to the public, let's go through this, and let's put all those discussions on the table. And I totally agree with you that people like yourself and others are very sincere about this, except the proof is in the pudding.
So and I'll take my time because I'd love to get to a lot more here, but I would love to continue to have that discussion. I would love to not just get a no on that, because I can tell you we're sincere about it and we could put everything on the table to try to solve this. I do want to, on your point on the debt, so very briefly so that people understand this, initially when Social Security was put in place, we were taking in more money coming in than was going out, correct? When did that change? When did Social Security no longer begin to receive more money annually than they were paying out? Mr. Goss?
Well, most recently, that has occurred in 2010. It was expected to be in 2020 at the time of the 83 amendments, but because of some of the changes mentioned.
Since 2010, we've been paying out more than we've been taking in.
Exactly.
And within 9 years, the difference, the trust, which was the difference that has been accumulating over time, that has been borrowed and is being paid back, in 9 years, that expires, right? That is gone. We no longer have excess funds. Am I right on that?
On a combined basis, maybe 10 years,
So
but on that order.
So at that point, unless something changes, people will no longer get all of their Social Security benefits because we don't have money to pay it, correct?
Under current law, we
Yes.
cannot pay what's not in the fund.
Or if at that time Congress decides to make it up by taking on additional debt, that's a choice we could make, right? We could continue to pay benefits if nothing has changed by taking on additional debt and paying for those benefits.
Unprecedented, but anything is possible.
But at that point, it would add to the debt, right?
If Congress were to change the law and say that we will borrow from the public in order
The
to.
only point I'm making, and I'd love to have more conversation about this publicly, that's why we need a commission to talk about this, is that this will contribute. There's a fundamental problem. We have far less workers than we do retirees. That ratio is far different. And so we need more workers. By the way, I agree with Ms. Sanchez, who I don't often agree with, on immigration. It is something that's a partial solution here. We need a lot more workers. We should be talking about legal immigration. But it's a great conversation. I wish others would agree that we need to continue to have this conversation. This is how I think a commission could work. We would take this conversation across America. We would begin to have a real understanding of the facts and how they exist. We just can't have that conversation in 5 minutes each here. I only get 4 if I give some to you, but I'd love to continue this conversation. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence of time here.
Thank you, Mr. Smucker. Next, we'll go to our dear friend from the great state of Illinois, Mr. Snyder. You're recognized.
Thank you, and I'll say to not just my friend, my next-door neighbor, Mr. Smucker, I look forward to the conversation. I think it's important that we have it. I will challenge just one premise. I don't think it's a binary option. And Mr. Goss, I'm going to ask you about the trust fund in a second, but it's not just necessarily going to debt. There's no reason I'm not advocating this, but we could raise taxes to pay for it. There are a whole ways to do it, or we could, as was mentioned earlier in the conversation, increase the percent of income that is paid into Social Security as a piece of it. We need to have a discussion around all of those things. And Mr. Gus, I took a quick look at your biography. You're a little bit older than me. I graduated college in '83. I want to make sure that we're going to be in the same way. You were actually here in '83 when they were talking about Social Security. When I graduated, every one of my classmates and my cohort were told Social Security won't be there for you because it is insolvent. And then Congress acted. So we're talking about the trust fund being depleted. Why is there a trust fund in the first place? And I'll give the leading question. Wasn't the plan to create a trust fund for a period of time that would rise and then ultimately fall? Isn't that the design from the 1980s?
Well, the trust fund, we oftentimes refer to the money in the trust funds as a contingency reserve. This is not an advance-funded program. If we were a fully advance-funded program, our trust fund reserves would have to be about 25 times annual cost. We're only at about 1.5 or so times annual cost now because it's supposed to be a contingency reserve if, as some have mentioned, we were to hit another recession at some point and our income started to drop relative to our cost. We need to have some time to draw on those contingency reserves so that you all will have time to make changes to address that issue.
But the goal was to buy time in the 1980s. And here I am now, 40 plus years since then, and people that I went to school with, that I grew up with, are beginning to retire. And for many of them, their retirement and the security of their retirement is standing on a foundation of Social Security that they didn't believe would be there for them 40 years ago. But because of the work we did in this, work those before us did in Congress, extended it. And I think now it's falling on our shoulders to figure out how do we make sure that the next generation, the young people, and the young people graduating today, in '83 when I graduated, we had a recession. It was the tail end of the recession, and the economy had great success ever since. The kids graduating today first graduated 4 years ago from high school in the teeth of COVID, now are graduating, and the challenges are different. The least we can do is stand there for them. But I think there's also a way that we do it. So, the Republican Study Committee's proposal of cutting Social Security by $1.5 trillion puts a burden on those who can least afford it, who are depending on Social Security. The idea of raising the retirement age, life expectancy is in many cases tied, or at least there's a correlation to income. And those who are in the highest income brackets, when they retire, let's assume it's 67 right now, their life expectancy at retirement is another 20 plus years. But those who are in the lowest quintile, their life expectancy at retirement is less than 10 years. It's a factor of health, of lifestyle, it doesn't matter why. If we raise the retirement age from 67 to 70 on these people, we're literally cutting their expected retirement by fully a third. People who have worked their entire life, who have followed the rules, who have struggled their entire life to make ends meet, and we're to tell them that their golden years are going to be cut by a third, that just doesn't seem fair. So we need to have these conversations. We need to be working together, Republicans and Democrats across the aisle, but we have to do it in a way that recognizes the original intent of Social Security, an insurance program to give Americans, after a lifetime of service and contribution to their communities and their nation, a dignified and secure retirement. And that's why, Mr. Smucker, I look forward to working with you. We just have to walk one office over, but with our other colleagues to have these conversations and I do agree, we have to take it to the public. And I'm grateful for our ranking member, Mr. Larson, your leadership and work, and you've done incredible yeoman's effort with Social Security 2100. How do we take this not just for another 20 or 30 years? I think earlier it was said Dr. Swagel, I think you were asked the question. You said if we took it to 90%, we would add 13 years. Okay? 13 years is great if you're in your 80s. If you're 25 years old, 13 years doesn't solve the problem. How do we add 75 years to this, to do it in a way that reflects our values as a country, the hard work American individuals and their enterprises are doing to grow our country? And so I'm over my time. I'm sure I have lots of questions for all of you, but I don't want to keep us longer. Let me just say thank you to the chairman and ranking member for this hearing. We have to get this done. It is our generation who is benefiting from Social Security that needs to make sure that the next generations have the same benefits that we have. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Next gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Feenstra, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Ferguson, Ranking Member Larson. Thank you also, Dr. Swagel and Mr. Gross and Mr. Hudson. Thank you for being here today. We've got obviously a lot of concerns with Social Security, and we got to resolve them. But we also have to be singing from the same songbook, understanding what's happening. Dr. Swagel, I've got a lot of things to talk about, but I want to just ask you, does Social Security, all right, payments create debt? I mean, I'm hearing from the other side that there's this view that it doesn't. And I would like you to explain to me, does it create debt?
There's lots of ways to look at it, and I realize that's part of the confusion. The $150 billion that I think Steve and I both, talked about, today that's being funded by the Treasury. The cash has to come from the Treasury to get that $150 billion.
Right. It's got to redeem its assets.
Exactly.
Correct? I mean, Social Security's got to redeem its assets.
Yep, and it's an asset for Social Security, but a liability for the Treasury. The Treasury borrows.
Thank you. And so what does the Treasury got to do again? So you got to redeem the assets, but how does the Treasury redeem its assets?
To come up with the cash, the Treasury.
Yeah, it comes up with the cash by selling bonds, right?
Selling bonds, everything that goes
Thank
into
you. Yeah, exactly right. So it actually is creating to our debt, right?
To redeem the assets in the trust fund, the Treasury has to borrow and create debt.
Yes, it's got to create debt. Yes. Mr. Gross.
So if we redeem $100 billion of debt that is owed to the trust funds, and we trade that for $100 billion that is now owed to the public, it's merely a swap. The total federal debt is unchanged.
But you still got to sell bonds to do that. The Treasury's still got to sell bonds to do that. Is that a fair statement?
It has to sell bonds to the public by redeeming the same amount of bonds that it now are held by the trust fund.
Thank you. But Mr. Swagel, can you answer that?
Yeah, the numbers that we focus on are debt held by the public.
Yes.
So what Steve is saying is correct. The debt held by the public goes up.
The debt held by the public, yes. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that you still got to sell Treasury bills. You still got to sell T-bills.
That's right, to the market.
To the market. Right? And when you do that, that's necessarily getting a loan. That's going further into debt.
You're redeeming one loan and creating another.
What I'm trying to have everybody understand here is that we got a problem, okay? We got a problem. And I think we all agree to this, that we have a problem. And there's a lot of insightful ways that we can look at this. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, was it 2032 now, the CBO's outlook, I think it's 2032, am I right? Fair statement?
It's 2033. It just
2033.
The end of 32.
Right.
To the very
So,
beginning.
Dr. Swagel, and so what is going to be the percentage cut per Social Security recipient right now at 2033?
So we have about 21%.
21%. So what you're telling the public, I just want to make sure we're fair here, you're telling the public that they're going to see a 21% cut in their Social Security if we do nothing.
That's correct.
Okay. Everybody get that? I just want to make sure the public gets that. 21% cut in 2033 if we do nothing. So that means we got to act. That means we got to do something. Thank you, by the way, for holding this, because this is very important. All right? So what I did, I think I created the Senior Saves Act that creates a accurate forecast. I think right now the CBO, the 10-year outlook showing the outlays, is not an accurate forecast because it just continues in full regardless of the trust fund's exhaustion. Can you talk about this a little bit, Dr. Swagel?
Yes, for sure. So under the Balanced Budget Act of 1985, our baseline projections are required to show outlays as if the trust fund continues even after it's exhausted. So the scheduled benefits.
Yes.
We show both the scheduled and payable, but the baseline by law shows the scheduled.
Yes. And again, here's the problem. It's a false narrative, right? I mean, we're making assumptions here. You don't have to answer that. I just want everybody to understand that we got to have accurate data. We got to make sure the CBO is telling everybody, and just like I'm telling everybody, by 2033, you're going to get a 21% cut in your Social Security if we don't do something. So you might want to tell your congressmen and women, you better act. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Iowa. Thanks again to each of you for being here. I would like to say, we've got one more member coming in before we get before we wave the flag here, so we're going to have one more.
No worries.
I was going to cut you off, but Mr. Larson insisted that you get your 5 minutes, so thank you, John, for that. So we will now recognize Mr. Estes for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Larson, for looking out for me. I appreciate that, my good friend. And thank you all for being here today to talk through some of these issues that are so important for everyday Americans. You know, today's hearing obviously is critically important, as both the CBO and the trustees have, on their most recent assessment, projected that Social Security's trust fund will be unable to pay full retirement benefits starting in 2033. According to the projections, that means that tens of millions of seniors and their families who rely on the programs would experience immediate benefit cuts. Unfortunately, a lot of those folks are already experiencing cuts thanks to the sky-high inflation that's 19.9% since January 2021. And rising prices hurt those on a fixed income, and just like so many of our seniors. You know, a key driver of the inflation is the uncontrolled and insatiable desire to spend. Our debt now stands at $34.6 trillion and grows by $100,000 a second. Simply unsustainable. Even if we got our spending under control in Congress, we still have a problem. And discretionary spending, actually the spending that we get to vote on as members, counts for less than 30% of all government spending. And CBO projects that Social Security will eclipse all discretionary spending, including defense, by 2029. So if we're going to make real changes to preserve Social Security, we have to talk about responsible reform. I know in an election year, there's a lot of rhetoric about how do you cut Social Security, but I think we all can agree we don't want seniors to suffer through that process. And the truth is, if we put our heads in the sand and do nothing now, it's American seniors who will suffer the most. As it stands now, in the next decade, if no action is taken, Social Security recipients will start receiving 75 cents on the dollar when insolvency is reached. I want to talk a little bit about, you know, what's the impact and how are we being impacted. And something that's obviously having an impact on Social Security is illegal immigration. Since President Biden took office, there have been more than 2.15 million encounters on the southwest border alone, and we can't be sure how many people have crossed into our country. Mr. Goss, how do the Social Security trustees account for the impact of illegal immigrations in your assumptions, and has it been accounted for in the current trustees report?
Absolutely, we always have. We look at total immigration, both immigration subject to the legal limits and also undocumented immigration coming into the country. By the way, the undocumented are generally looked at as people who come across the border without documentation. Many of these people come to the country and eventually become legal permanent residents or may have children while they're here who will then be citizens. That actually contributes positively to the economy and to Social Security. So on the bottom line, really, immigration of all forms is actually a positive in the realm that we're in now, where the birth rates in the country are as low as they are. So immigration is actually a positive.
It's positive in the short term before those individuals start taking benefits, right?
Well, it's positive also in the long term, because if we have more people coming into the country, whether they're initially undocumented or not, if they come in their 20s or 30s, which is generally the age range for new immigrants, if they have children, then that adds to the future population. It adds to the growth of our population, which is very much a positive.
Right, which, I mean, we're a country of immigrants, so we want to continue to have, legal immigration that has an impact and be able to come out of that shadow economy. Do you take into account any dealings with how much of that folks that have come here illegally and not had a legal right to cross the border, that are more likely working in the shadow economy, that they're paid cash under the table, in which case they wouldn't be captured as far as being able to pay payroll taxes?
If people are literally paid cash, then of course there's going to be no record of that towards benefits or towards their paying in payroll taxes. However, in many cases where people are either undocumented or have come on a temporary visa and overstay it, they're not legal permanent residents. In many cases, those individuals will, through their employers, still be paying payroll taxes that go into the trust fund, and very likely they will never receive benefits. So in addition to the possibility of their having children on our shores, there's a possibility of that kind of immigration actually having a positive. We had a little actuarial note back in 2013 that walks through this in some detail.
Yeah. Well, I'm about out of time, but I don't know, Dr. Swigel, did you have anything that you could include and talk about your assumptions?
Oh, okay. No, just the same thing, that we're looking carefully at immigration and the share of the immigrants who are paying into the system and the share who are collecting benefits. So it's something we're working on carefully right now.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence, and I'm out of time. I'd like to ask some more questions, but I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and please be advised that members have 2 weeks to submit written questions to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. With that, the subcommittee stands adjourned.